We've had an initial meeting, that's all there is to say about it at the moment.
The Tories and Lib Dems have been locked in talks tonight. Can they do a deal? After an extraordinary election, the extraordinary aftermath. Could a con-Lib deal work?
I want to make a big, open and comprehensive offer to the Liberal Democrats.
I think it is now for the Conservative Party to prove that it is capable of seeking to govern in the national interest.
What happens next?
So what exactly is on offer from the Tories?
Will you give up your job to Vince Cable?
We'll speak to Ken Clark, Alistair Campbell and Jim Wallace. And we'll be asking our political panel to go into the proverbial smoke-filled room and come up with a deal. And all this in the middle of an international debt crisis. How will the markets take to the new politics? We speak to a hedge fund manager about Britain's prospects now. Thousands of voters turned away from polling stations. What went wrong? Good evening. This election remains a great conundrum, with the politicians still struggling to cope with the consequences. Tonight, talks have taken place between the Lib Dems and Tories, which could lead to a momentous deal between the two sides. In a specially extended programme, we'll be asking, where are the red lines in the con-Lib negotiations? Is it voting reform, spending cuts, Trident? And if their talks fail, is there even an outside chance that Nick Clegg could deliver in some form a fourth Labour term? After an election campaign that was dominated by the glare of the TV election debates, the outcome could still be decided in a dark corner of some room in Westminster. So what is the final tally of seats? With one seat left to declare in 3 weeks' time, the Conservatives have 306 seats, 20 short of an overall majority, with 36% of the share of the vote. Labour has 258 seats with a 29% share. The Liberal Democrats, 57 seats and a 23% share. The Democratic Unionist Party got 8 seats, the Scottish National Party 6, Plaid Cymru 3, and the other parties 10. Here is Michael Crick.
Tonight saw historic talks inside the Cabinet Office at 70 Whitehall. Initial discussions between top Tories and Lib Dems to forge a deal to form Her Majesty's next government. Not involving Cameron or Clegg face-to-face yet, but 4-man teams of lieutenants, including William Hague and George Osborne for the Tories, Chris Huhne and Danny Alexander for the Lib Dems.
Are you going to do a deal with the Tories?
This morning, Nick Clegg turned up at Liberal Democrat headquarters, admitting disappointment at his party losing seats, when many expected big gains after his performances in the TV debates. Yet suddenly, it's Clegg the kingmaker, the man who'd long denied he'd ever be that. But he's stuck by what he'd said before, that the party who got the most votes and seats in this election has first right to try and govern.
It seems this morning that it's the Conservative Party that has more votes and more seats, though not an absolute majority. And that is why I think it is now for the Conservative Party to prove that it is capable of seeking to govern in the national interest.
And when it comes to Lib Dem cooperation, he said, the overnight result makes electoral reform even more urgent.
This election campaign has made it abundantly clear that our electoral system is broken. It simply doesn't reflect the hopes and aspirations of the British people. So I repeat again my assurance that whatever happens in the coming hours and days and weeks, I will continue to argue not only for the greater fairness in British society, not only the greater responsibility in economic policy making, but also for the extensive, real reforms that we need to fix our broken political system.
And Mr Clegg's now in a strong position because the other parties can't rule without his say-so. There are 650 MPs in the new House, and a government, of course, needs at least half that to keep the show on the road. But the Sinn Féin MPs never turn up on principle, so the actual winning post is only 323. The Conservatives should end up with 307. Add in the Democratic Unionists, that could bring their total to 315. Still 8 short. Labour will have 258 MPs. Add in the SDLP, the Scots and Welsh Nationalists, one or two others. That could bring them to 272. But it'd be a pretty diverse bunch and still more than 50 short of a majority. So the 57 Liberal Democrats hold the balance of power. And each of the major parties will need them to form a stable government. Gordon Brown came back to London still Prime Minister and refusing to budge, but a former number 10 advisor strongly urged him to do so at once, with dignity.
What, in my view, should happen is that Labour, Gordon Brown, should resign with good grace. I think if he tries to stitch up a deal, it will look like that. It will look like a stitch-up to the electorate. And that Labour and the Liberal Democrats should go into opposition, into a constructive opposition.
Mr. Brown was having none of that, but he said he understood, when he emerged this lunchtime, why Clegg should want to talk first to Cameron.
I understand and completely respect the position of Mr. Clegg in stating that he wishes first to make contact with the leader of the Conservative Party. As you know, we already have in place mechanisms and facilities that will give the political parties any civil service support that they may need. Mr. Cameron and Mr. Clegg should clearly be entitled to take as much time as they feel necessary. For my part, I should make clear that I would be willing to see any of the party leaders. Clearly, should the discussions between Mr. Cameron and Mr. Clegg come to nothing, then I would, of course, be prepared to discuss with Mr. Clegg the areas where there may be some measure of agreement between our two parties.
And he implied that he'd extend Labour's proposed referendum on the AV voting system to include other, more proportional systems favoured by the Lib Dems. So 45 minutes ago, Gordon Brown made it clear he's not resigning, but he said he's willing to talk to any party leader. What does David Cameron make of that? We should find out in a few moments' time here at the St Stephen's Club. Mr Cameron said he could back the Lib Dems on some of their schools policy, on ID cards and on tax cuts for the low-paid. But on voting reform, he only offered a committee.
On our political system, we agree with the Liberal Democrats that reform is urgently needed to help restore trust, and that reform must include the electoral system. The Liberal Democrats have their ideas, we have our ideas. For example, that all seats should be of equal size so that votes can have an equal value in a first-past-the-post system. And other parties have constructive proposals to put forward as well. So I believe we will need an all-party committee of inquiry on political and electoral reform. So I think we have a strong basis for a strong government. Inevitably, the negotiations we're about to start will involve compromise. That is what working together in the national interest means.
So David Cameron there offering an olive branch to the Liberal Democrats, the pupil premium, tax cuts for the lower paid, and a committee on electoral and political reform. Will that be enough to reach some kind of deal? But what about jobs? How about a Lib Dem as Chancellor, for instance?
Will you give up your job to Vince Cable?
Within minutes, in fact, senior Tories were indeed dangling ministerial posts before the Lib Dems.
The important thing is to tackle the problems we have in the economy. They are very serious. I don't think people realise how serious this structural deficit is. It's grown up over 10 years. It needs to be dealt with comprehensively. That can be best dealt with a government that is secure in the House of Commons. If the price for that is one or two Liberals in the Cabinet, it's a price in the national interest that I personally would be prepared to bear.
A friendly phone call between David Cameron and Nick Clegg this afternoon led to tonight's talks at 70 Whitehall. They lasted 90 minutes.
We've had an initial meeting.
Senior Tories said little afterwards, while the Lib Dem team left by a separate exit.
And we'll be hearing more from Michael Crick later. Well, I'm joined now by Ken Clarke, the Shadow Business Secretary, and by Jim Wallace from the Liberal Democrats, who was himself Deputy First Minister in a Labour-Lib Dem coalition in the Scottish Parliament. In a moment, we're speaking to the Labour strategist, Alistair Campbell. Ken Clarke, you heard there was a 90-minute meeting tonight. How long do you think the Conservatives and Lib Dems have got to get a plan together?
Oh, I think they've got 2 or 3 days, would be my guess. I think they've got to take a little time over it. You can't just do all this frenetically. I think senior Liberals, senior Conservatives actually agree that this is a test of whether we can put the national interest first. Labour is plainly defeated. They had an appalling defeat. It would be somewhat farcical if Gordon Brown carried on simply by throwing out offers to the Liberals to cling to power. What we have to do is try to get some compromise between our positions. We have to produce a strong programme for a strong and stable government that should aim to last for 2 or 3 more years, because I think it will take that time to deal with the overriding problem facing the country of a serious economic crisis and a serious problem of debt and deficit that we have to deal with.
Right, well, let's talk about the red lines then. And can I just talk to you, first of all, about voting reform? Can you reassure voters, is first past the post for the Westminster election non-negotiable?
Well, we said we'd have a speakers' conference or a conference of some kind between the parties. Well, we didn't rule it out. What we're doing is giving a very broad offer to the Liberals, saying, let us put on the table the things where we think we're quite close to agreement, the things where we don't agree. Let us concentrate on the key things.
Let's deal with that.
And the way you deal with electoral reform is to start having a speakers' conference, is the usual form, but an all-party conference would do, where you put on the table the rival suggestions, see if you can reach any agreement. There are other constitutional reforms that I've been urging for years as well to make Parliament stronger in its control of the executive, on which Liberals, I think, would agree.
Let's look at that conference. We've had lots of different inquiries, but let's look at that conference. Are you saying tonight, then, that you are not ruling out the removal of the first-past-the-post system for Westminster elections and the institution of some form of PR, that it is negotiable?
No, I strongly prefer the first-past-the-post system. I'm not going back on everything I've been arguing, although the subject hardly came up, actually, for the last 3 or 4 weeks.
But you are negotiating it.
Obviously, no, I'm not negotiating on Newsnight either, with the greatest respect. But it is fair to point out that all the parties have their propositions. All the parties actually have a variety of views within their ranks. And the thing to do to make progress on that is actually not simply to agree to one proposal that the smaller party comes up with, but actually to have a conference where you discuss it. It's not the most pressing issue. The most pressing issue is the economic crisis.
Yes, but in order to get stability in any kind of coalition or any kind of deal, something that won't just it will survive the first hail of bullets, you have to be on a par. And to be on a par with the Liberal Democrats, it seems to me one of the red lines they have is voting reform for the Westminster elections. And if you can't deliver that, are you going to get some kind of deal?
I don't believe that is a red line. I don't believe.
You don't believe it's a red line for the Liberal Democrats? Can I just bring Jim Wallace in on
the opposite.
Let me ask Jim Wallace on that. Voting reform.
Nick Clegg said the opposite during the election.
I'm not coming into a studio to draw red lines anywhere.
But this is, Jim Wallace, with respect, this is a red line that you've been moving and moving and moving for years. This is not my job.
I'm not doing the negotiation. I'm a member of the Parliamentary Party in the House of Lords. It's mostly the principal responsibility as a member of my colleagues in the House of Commons, and I'm not negotiating. But what I can say is that a system of voting change, electoral reform, proportional representation, was part of the agenda for fairness, that we had a political fairness for reform of the political system that Nick Clegg put forward during the election.
Exactly.
And
he talked about it time and again. And just be quite clear, because voters out there are wondering what the Liberal Democrats actually stand for. Because when voting reform is talked of regularly by the Liberal Democrats as being, this system we have in this country is totally unfair, we need to move to a system of PR. And the first whiff of a chance of power, you go, PR, who cares?
That's not true, Kirsty. You're making this up. What I think Ken Clarke and I both are saying, with all due respect to the power and might of the Newsnight programme, this is not where the negotiations are taking place.
Right.
But what I would also make clear is that you said what the Liberal Democrats stand for. Nick Clegg was clear during the election. There were 4 key things. There was a fair tax system. There was a
a better deal and a fairer deal for our children. There was...
Trident?
I'm telling you the four, if you just be patient. The third one was with regard to the economy, and particularly what could be done through the green economy, and the fourth one was reform of the political system. Now, these are the four things. There can be no doubt. How many times did Nick Clegg spell them out? And I'm sure these will be the principles that our people will take into any discussions.
So on the question of the economy, Vince Cable garnered a great deal of respect among certain politicians for his treatment of the economy. So cabinet posts then, it is possible, of course, to have two Treasury cabinet posts. Can you see the chance that perhaps George Osborne and Vince Cable could be working in concert in the cabinet?
Well, cabinet places must be on the table. I think what David Cameron has done is make a broad, generous offer because we believe it's in the national interest. And Kirsty, you seem quite determined to get Jim and I to find areas where we flatly disagree. Things like tax reform, things about tackling the economy. I don't always disagree with Vince Cable. I said during the campaign I tend to agree with him about 70% of the time.
It was a phrase
we can
often
discuss
heard.
these things, and if actually the Liberals will reach such agreement, the Liberals are ready to participate in the government itself. I personally agree with my old friend John Major, but Jim Wallace and myself are not doing the negotiations, but I think all serious Liberals, all serious Conservatives hope that these negotiations will be conducted on a serious basis because this country is in a crisis and it needs a strong, stable government. And it doesn't want continuing wrangles and deals and a government that has no authority to do anything. And that's what the leaders of the two parties will be trying to achieve.
So in order to move forward, in order to save the economy, would you be prepared to give way in cabinet and give Vince Cable your job?
I certainly accept that if the two parties get together and agree to collaborate and share out posts, then of course there will be fewer posts for Conservatives, and it's up to the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister will have to consult his partner as to how those jobs are allocated. But for heaven's sake, we've got to show we have a grown-up political class in this country, and that the leaders of two parties at least can act in the national interest. And if the whole thing is not going to depend on individuals squabbling about what job they have, and actually what we should look at is the many areas where the two parties could collaborate, and the fact, I hope, all of us agreed that what the public wanted to do is sort out the economic mess which Gordon Brown has landed in our
I just want to ask you a couple of questions to you and Jim Wallace about Europe. Nick Clegg, Ken Clark, said that in Europe you're in bed with a bunch of nutters. I'm sure you remember the phrase very well. Nutters, anti-Semites, people who, homophobes, people who don't believe that climate change exists. Surely you can't still
do I don't agree with that,
those.
but what's that got to do with the coalition negotiations?
Well, you have to sing out the same hymn sheet, don't you?
David, my views on Europe are not very different from many Liberals, although I don't agree on the particular point of groupings in the European Parliament.
I think
on Europe, what we've said is there should be no more transfer of powers centrally, and actually, although a Europhile, myself, a pro-European, I think we've had quite enough of treaties and arguments about competence. I don't expect or want to see any further transfer of powers, and most Liberals don't either. All this other stuff, you're trying to repeat some of it.
But do you think you're in bed with a bunch of nutters?
You're just trying to get us to repeat the knockabout stuff in the election.
Why not? Are you in bed with a bunch of nutters?
We're forming a government now. What on earth has this got to do?
I think we let me
Kirsty, I hope our viewers have some sense of the national interest. The world is watching us. Can we, having produced a hung parliament, which I regret, now produce a strong government with the authority to deliver an agreed programme to get control of our deficit and debt and get growth going? We have 2.5 million unemployed. We have the threat of a crisis in the bond markets if we don't get on top of events. Let the leaders of the two parties that have emerged best from this election get together and try to get a stable government in the national interest.
Trying to secure financial stability against the background is of crucial importance. The other thing I would say, when I negotiated two coalitions in the Scottish Parliament, and I'll tell you this, the last thing we did was the question of seats and appointments. There's no point in doing that unless you can get an agreement on policy.
Thank you both very much indeed. Alistair Campbell, you've been sitting in silence listening to this. It's not over to the fat lady sings. If Con Lib deal breaks down, there's a kind of fantasy second option here, isn't there, where there's a kind of Labour, Liberal Democrat, Uncle Tom Cobley and all cobbled together.
I think what Gordon was saying today was that it's obvious that David Cameron, having won the most seats, and Nick Clegg having said during the campaign that he would first go to the person who won the most seats and the party who won the most seats, that if that came to nothing, then it would be incumbent upon all of the leaders to explore all of the possibilities. And I think that's a perfectly proper constitutional thing that Gordon put forward today.
But if there was even the prospect of Labour and Liberal Democrats, you can't do it alone. You have to bring along a whole series of people. And the chance of any stability in that and people taking the whip would be minimal.
Well, you've got to deal with the arithmetic that's been given to you, and you've also, the people have delivered a verdict which is very, very unclear. Now, what's happening at the moment with these discussions that are going on, which are fascinating to watch and are going to become more fascinating. It's interesting, for example, that Jim didn't mention, for example, Trident or illegal immigration and so forth. And also, I thought it was fascinating to see William Hague coming out of 70 Whitehall. My understanding is that within the Foreign Office, they are already preparing William Hague's European policy, which is eye-watering, and which no self-respecting Liberal Democrat is ever going to want to support.
What was very clear from the campaign is there absolutely no love lost between Nick Clegg and Gordon Brown. If Gordon Brown's removal was the price of a deal with the Liberal Democrats for the good of the country, you might say, would it be worth it?
Well, I don't think Nick Clegg would be in a position to make that sort of demand. And let me just say as well, look, all three parties, let's be frank about this.
But Labour might be in a position to think that this actually was the best programme for the future. If you want to move on, maybe Gordon Brown is a dead man walking.
All three parties did not have the election results that they wanted. The Conservatives didn't do nearly as well as they wanted to, nor did the
Gordon Brown did worse than he'd done since the mid-80s.
No, but listen, we fought not that long ago, just a few days ago, you were all saying we're going to come third. And actually, the Liberal Democrats, as we thought they would, they faded.
Don't you need to move on quickly in order to kind of, have some kind of rebirth of Labour? Don't you need to move on quickly? And the way to move on quickly is to say, Gordon Brown, you never won an election. And actually, we either have to see another Labour leader in power, or, you're not seriously going to suggest that Gordon Brown and Nick Clegg would form a coalition.
Well, what I am seriously suggesting is that Gordon Brown is still the Prime Minister at a time of
for the weekend.
At a time of constitutional difficulty, which he as Prime Minister has to take the country through. What's going on now are these perfectly reasonable, proper discussions between Cameron's team and Clegg's team. Let's see where they get to. I think a lot of people... I know people in Labour headquarters yesterday who are passionate Labour supporters who voted Lib Dem in their constituencies because they really don't want a Tory government. A lot of people like that will be very, very disappointed if they see Nick Clegg, meant to be the good guy of this campaign, suddenly propping up David Cameron in government.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
So, despite performing poorly in yesterday's election, Nick Clegg finds himself just about holding the balance of power. But how should he best play his hand? And can he really bring his party along with him? David Grossman reports, and his report contains some flash photography.
Last night could be called a catastrophic success for the Liberal Democrats. They lost seats, but in the process gained something extremely valuable, the balance of power.
But there are two big hurdles to any coalition or even agreement. Firstly, they've got to thrash out areas where the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives can work together. And then, secondly, they've got to sell it to the party's activists and MPs.
Nick Clegg's going to try and work out what his initial negotiating position is, what would he accept from David Cameron. But there's also going to be a huge amount of work behind the scenes to try and keep the various different elements of the Liberal Democrat Party on side.
In Westminster today, deep in a phone conversation, is the Lib Dem point man in the negotiations with the Conservatives. David Laws is now an MP, but in 1999 he brokered the coalition between the Liberal Democrats and Labour in the Scottish Parliament. Last September, Mr Laws described the lessons he'd learned from that process.
There is huge external pressure to strike an agreement quickly, so being prepared, thinking through your priorities and being able to conclude a negotiation within a reasonable period of time is very, very important. And that may mean that some policy issues can't be resolved automatically within the coalition agreement, but there needs to be a process for that. The second thing, I think, is that there has to be some kind of written, formal process of agreement on policy. You can't simply have some sort of arrangement about which particular ministerial posts are going to be taken up. There has to be an underlying policy agreement, and that has to be written down, and it has to rely on more than the trust between the party leaders, though the trust between the party leaders is also extremely important.
But after the bitter election campaign, one is tempted to ask what trust. Nick Clegg and David Cameron traded savage blows.
David Cameron seems to think that it's just his turn to govern. He seems to think that he should just inherit power rather than earn it. You can't trust the Conservatives.
The great plan of Nick Clegg is all becoming clear. He's only interested in one thing, and that is changing our electoral system so that we have a permanent hung parliament, we have a permanent coalition, we never have strong and authoritative and decisive government. That's what he wants to do. It's now becoming clear he wants to hold the whole country to ransom.
And that issue of electoral reform could ultimately prove the biggest hurdle to any deal. The Lib Dems don't seem to be in the mood for any sort of compromise.
Not only the Liberal Democrats that have been arguing for fair votes, it's the public. And of course the result in this election reflects the fact that we now have three-party politics. The public recognise that, and that's why the public are now very supportive of a change in our voting system.
On electoral reform, there is a chasm between the position of the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats, and trying to find some sort of arrangement that would be acceptable to the Lib Dems but still be acceptable to the Conservatives is a huge challenge.
And that process is further complicated by the Lib Dems constitution. The party's members and MPs would have to approve any formal deal.
We're talking about coalitions, we're talking major concessions. Personally, I can't see that happening, but you never know. I'm not ruling it out at this stage, but it would have to be, it would have to be fairly major U-turns, and I'm not sure the Conservative backbenchers themselves would wear those sorts of concessions.
The Lib Dems parliamentary party will be meeting tomorrow to discuss what to do. The party's federal executive will also have to meet. A member of that group has told Newsnight that David Cameron's offer was insulting. So if a formal coalition proves too tricky, well, Nick Clegg and David Cameron could agree something short of that, a sort of non-aggression pact.
That's a possible solution, almost a stalemate solution. But that's hardly grabbing the big prize from the Liberal Democrats' perspective. One would have thought with this parliamentary arithmetic that if the Liberal Democrats aren't pushing to take cabinet seats in this sort of position, then what sort of electoral outcome are they waiting for?
Nick Clegg, arriving back at his party headquarters tonight, wasn't speaking to the press, but he has already chatted to David Cameron on the phone. But this was apparently just an opening discussion, too early for any substantive negotiations. Do not count on this being a speedy process.
David Grossman and Michael Crick is here, but you heard Ken Clark saying 2 or 3 days. What kind of deal do you think this could be in 2 or 3 days? A coalition or much looser than that? What can they cobble?
My own hunch is it would end up as something much looser. I think the problem is producing a deal that will satisfy the MPs and activists of both the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats. Now, as David was explaining, there's this sort of triple lock mechanism within the Liberal Democrats, although every time I look at it, it seems like a quadruple lock with incredibly complicated hurdles. Now, at one point, you would have said, well, Nick Clegg can probably use his authority to overcome that. The problem tonight is he's just come out of an election where he's lost 5 seats. His authority is not what it would have been if he'd won 80, 90, 100 seats, which is what we thought at one time. And it's difficult to see what kind of compromise, particularly there can be on the electoral reform issue. There may be a way out, perhaps, if the Conservatives were to offer something, perhaps on electoral reform, say, for the House of Lords or local government in England and Wales. But I can't see that going through either. So I think at the end of the day, you're probably going to see a confidence and supply arrangement whereby the Liberal Democrats agree not to vote down the government in a confidence vote, to let them have their budget measures through, and the rest of it will be done on a case-by-case basis, which is an arrangement which frequently happens in parliamentary systems in other Commonwealth countries.
But briefly, that is not going to lead to a kind of long-term stability, and with the grassroots so unhappy, presumably it could fall at the first hurdle.
Indeed, and of course the grassroots will also be worrying about the prospect of another election in which they may lose seats, and an election which the Conservatives will have the money to fight, and the Liberal Democrats probably won't.
Thank you very much, Michael. Well, we've heard some of the concerns in the Lib Dem grassroots about the Con-Lib deal, but what about the Conservative Party? Can David Cameron sell a deal to them? I'm joined by Tim Montgomery from the Conservative Home website and by Michael Portillo, the former Conservative Cabinet Minister. Hello to both of you.
Hello.
Tim Montgomery, you've heard there about what the Liberal Democratic grassroots wanted by way of electoral reform. Can David Cameron offer electoral reform to the Liberal Democrats without absolutely well, annihilating the support of the grassroots?
I think the Conservative grassroots are very open to all sorts of cooperation with the Liberal Democrats on issues like the environment, localism, civil liberties. I think they'll be pleased with what David Cameron said today about saying the issue of Europe and immigration are non-negotiable. The problem is exactly what you raise, this whole issue of proportional representation. We polled the Tory grassroots at the start of the year, asked them whether proportional representation would be an acceptable compromise if a coalition deal was necessary, and nearly 90% said no. For most Conservatives, proportional representation is something they just will not accept. So I don't know how David Cameron will manage or finesse it, but it's a very difficult issue.
Well, will David Cameron be able to deliver something that's suitable for the Liberal Democrats without, you know, the problems of the grassroots in his own party, or perhaps he just has to ignore the grassroots?
Well, he's certainly in a position to lead. This is a very dynamic situation. The thing is fluid, it's moving fast. He has a lot of room for manoeuvre because he is moving fast. He's moving well ahead of the grassroots. I mean, clinging to this electoral system, it doesn't seem to me to be a particularly good idea. I mean, David Cameron has established himself as the moderniser of the Conservative Party, and to set your face against modernising the electoral system seems to me, you know, not a good position to be in. So I think he has to propose a committee, because you can't just decide you're going to have one system and put it to a referendum. But what Nick Clegg has to believe is that David Cameron is for real. There has to be trust between them, that he really is interested in putting all the things on the table and having the parties discuss different electoral reforms.
But if there was PR for Westminster, and it seems that the Liberal Democrats, I mean, it would be a sop, wouldn't it, just to have Westminster for the Lords and also to have local authorities. If there is PR for instead of first past the post at Westminster, it could lock the Conservatives out for a generation.
Yeah, and the Conservatives object, of course, to proportional representation for more reasons than other than their self-interest. We worry about its implications for extreme parties holding the balance of power. We worry about the fact you can't change politicians. You can't get the rascals out in proportional representation systems quite so easily. Now, I accept what Michael's saying. First past the post is being tested to destruction at the moment, but generally it's a good system.
But I mean, what is the big game plan? Because this doesn't come out of anywhere. I mean, the big picture for David Cameron has to be a kind of revolutionary change.
Yes, I think that could easily follow. I mean, if the electoral system were to change, then I think the groupings of parties would change. But the objective for the time being is that we face an extraordinarily difficult economic situation, and we need a government that investors, the people on whose money we rely, they need to believe that the government can last 4 or 5 years. And the only way to do that is to have a full-blown coalition with the Liberal Democrats and to reach an accommodation on these things. And all other policy issues, I think, can be swept aside, because we're going to be obsessed as government for 5 years with the economy.
So this would be David Cameron's clause 4 moment. Would that cause a civil war in the Conservative Party?
Well, I think it's premature to talk in those terms, but where I think I disagree with Michael is something that Michael Crick was talking about just a moment ago. There is possibility of David Cameron and Nick Clegg agreeing on lots of things, but they're not the only people in this negotiation. It's the grassroots of the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats as well. And that potentially does make the coalition less stable than a minority government working on a case-by-case basis.
The noun that's being left out of this analysis is power. And power is the great motivation. The reason the Conservative Party exists is to get into power. It's the reason any of these parties exist. So what David Cameron is offering is power. Dependable power, steady power, lasting power, a stable government. And by the way, I don't think the Liberal Democrats are going to be immune or indifferent to the offer of cabinet seats. I mean, this again is a fantastic opportunity for them to prove that they can do things in government.
So as far as the grassroots, perhaps the right of the party are concerned, David Cameron may have to cut them free.
Well, I don't think that is even an option, really. There is a lot of interest.
Socially liberal, I mean, the right of the party is perhaps his albatross.
No, the media is rightly at the moment focused on the coalition that David Cameron needs to build outside of the party, but he also has to maintain his internal coalition as well. The Conservative Party will always need to be a broad church, and you can't isolate different wings of that broad church.
There's any number of countries in which there are proportional representation systems in which the right is quite frequently in government and quite frequently even on its own in government. So we needn't fear PR as much as all that.
Thank you both very much indeed. For the economy, these deliberations and the speed of a concrete solution is critical. The markets did not exactly plunge on the news of the hung parliament, but they did fall. The pound fell by nearly 2 cents against the dollar at one point today, and the FTSE is down 5.5% on the week. But this political dance is taking place amidst a growing financial meltdown in Europe. Our economics editor, Paul Mason, is here. How long before the markets decide that what's going on here is a real problem?
Well, what's happened, Kirsty, with the election results is that the two stories we've been reporting on, the European fiscal crisis and the UK election, have become one story. We are part of that crisis now, even though we're not part of the Eurozone, simply because investors are now worried about lending money to any government that doesn't look like it knows how to get its deficit down. We've not really even got a government. Let's look at how the markets reacted to the election result. This is the gilt market, and this blue line, if it goes up, it's bad because it implies the risk of lending to Alistair Darling is higher. Yesterday, on the left, that's election day, the Geiger counter's ticking. They wake up this morning, 8 o'clock, and it takes off. But it stops at 10:43 precisely. Why? Because Nick Clegg goes on the radio and offers the coalition. It falls back, it creeps up again as Gordon Brown makes the statement we heard earlier, and then it peaks and falls rapidly after David Cameron responds. So the market's there clearly responding to movements in politics.
Meanwhile, the global markets are being really knocked by what's happening in Europe. Why?
Well, let's look at the damage first of all. The stock markets in Frankfurt, in Milan, in Paris, down 3 to 5%. And then just look at these, the shares of banks in Greece, in Portugal and in Spain. They are heading now back in certainly 2 out of those countries towards where they were right after the Lehman crisis. And that's because banks have to hold sovereign debt. People feel that money's going to be lost on sovereign debt. It means that this Greek crisis, the Portuguese crisis, edges over into the banking system. Now, this weekend, the European Central Bank, or the authorities somewhere, have to do the equivalent of taking that funnel in the Gulf of Mexico and dropping it onto the crisis, onto the seabed, and stop staunching the flow of panic and chaos. Now, they've been called upon to print money and buy the debt. That's quantitative easing. We've done it here. That would blow the European Central Bank's modus operandi apart. So what's being talked about now is a big ring-fenced loan. 600 billion euros is being talked about as early as this weekend. But they have to do something because it's week after week of crisis.
And what concretely does the UK government, whichever government that might be, have to do?
Well, remember before the election, all that long time ago, they wouldn't tell us what 4/5 of the cuts were going to be. Now, when they're sitting across the table, they have to at least tell each other what they might be, because they can't negotiate. Is it going to be Trident? Is it going to be 20% VAT? Is it going to be the UK's first armoured division brought back from Germany and slimmed down, as the Tories briefed before the election? Interestingly, in these talks, the Tories sent their heaviest hitter on the economy, George Osborne. That signals they want to say to the Lib Dems, you accept our curve of deficit reduction, the fast, aggressive curve, because that's what's needed. The Lib Dems sent party strategists. Very interesting. So it just implies that the trade is going to have on the table is, you accept our deficit reduction plan, we give you some micro measures. It can't be anything else.
Paul Mason, thank you very much indeed. Well, hedge fund manager Hugh Hendry is here to give his views on things, and let's have a look at how the markets ended today. The FTSE 100 share index was down 138 points. In New York, the Dow Jones also closed down, and against the euro, the pound was down by nearly 1.5 cents. Against the dollar, pound was also down. So, Hugh Hendry, from your view, good news, bad news, coalition, possible talks, what does this do to the markets?
The markets have decided that it's bad news. It was an indulgent outcome. It was an outcome which was steadfast in refusing to acknowledge the need to take very difficult decisions.
So do you think the public got what it wanted then, or got what it deserves, I should say?
That's not for me to determine, but certainly I think there is precedent with, if I could remove myself from the politics, there was the precedent in that one of the parties suggested rather vigorous cuts in government spending, and it did so during the conference season last year, and after doing so, its opinion polls were obliterated, and then it stopped talking about cuts.
So in fact, we should have, the party should have been talking austerity, austerity, austerity all the way from the conference, all the way through the election campaign.
What I'm saying is the electorate, again, were rather indulgent, and they believe in the notion. We're hearing a new lexicon, a lexicon of disbelief. Yeah? We're hearing the notion of progressive taxation. We believe we can suspend our difficulties by notions such as Robin Hood, fairy tales, fairy tales. This is a fairy tale election.
So it may be a fairy tale election, but actually it's, the sting in the tail is that there has to be some kind of government at the end of it which can hold together. Well, the markets
It can't hold together. It can't hold together, right?
Well, that's a political judgment?
No, that is an economic judgment, because as the Bank of England governor reputedly said, that to take the cost out of government spending that is necessary, to control the deficit, would mean that whatever party endorsed it would be out of office for 20 years, right? There is no mandate.
Chalice, the idea that it's a hospital
now you could get away with that if you had a very, very strong endorsement, if you had a very high majority. Without that, it's not going to happen.
We're in a situation where we've got 2 or 3 days perhaps on this deal. If this deal doesn't work, perhaps there's another period of negotiation, could be maybe well into a week, 10 days. How long will the markets thole this indecision?
You will have a coalition government, but the clock is ticking. It will expire. It will probably expire within a year. International events are overwhelming. This is a very parochial concern. I'm afraid Paul's fantasy, that silly chart with the gilt yield going up and down, that is fantasy. That is reflecting the economic crisis at the heart of Europe and the economic crisis which has emerged in the banking sector. I'm afraid, again, like in 2008, the banking sector is becoming insolvent.
Hugh Henry, thank you very much indeed. Well, the electoral cat's cradle, in theory, gives the smaller parties more power. And today, Alex Salmond, the SNP leader, said the Nationalists will use their voting power in a hung parliament to protect Scotland from the consequences of London rule, and would join with 3 Plaid Cymru MPs in a Celtic alliance. But they've already ruled out a deal with the Tories. So how might the other significant bloc, the Democratic Unionists, play it? And was Ken Clarke right to say you can always do a deal with an Ulsterman? Liz McKean is in Belfast.
Northern Ireland's rolling countryside received just the one big political leader during the election campaign. Before a single vote was cast, the dealing had started. David Cameron appearing at this country hotel to urge people to back his alliance with the Ulster Unionists. If things don't work out with the Lib Dems, David Cameron may well need his Unionist MPs. The trouble is, he doesn't have any. He backed the wrong party. The one that could have given him some MPs, 8 of them, is the other Unionist party, the DUP. And they're incensed by the suggestion from Tory High Command that they're up for hire.
In the end, you can always do a deal with an Ulsterman, but it's not the way to run a modern, sophisticated society.
Ken Clarke's a buffoon whenever he decides to insult a vast majority of people on this island and tries to therefore insult citizens of the United Kingdom.
Ian Paisley Jr. kept it in the family when he won his father's North Antrim seat. Ken Clarke caused offence, but he was on the money. These Ulstermen will do a deal.
What will be factored into any arrangements, any discussions, is what is best for the general public here in Northern Ireland, and the overriding principle of ensuring political stability and economic calm across this United Kingdom.
In what's being called Ulster's Portillo moment, the leader of the DUP, Peter Robinson, lost his East Belfast seat after 31 years, swept away by a foul tide of personal and political scandal. He's vowed to stay on as First Minister at Stormont. It's not clear what role he'll play in negotiations at Westminster. The final seats haven't been declared yet, but already the Blackburys in Northern Ireland are buzzing. I'm told the senior Labour leadership has been in touch today several times, sounding out the DUP. So far, there's been no official contact from the Conservatives, but the DUP are expecting it and looking forward to it. And they'll be demanding that David Cameron eats the words he spoke to Jeremy Paxman, that Northern Ireland's bloated public sector be put on a crash diet.
Which parts of the country?
Well, the first one I think I'd pick out is Northern Ireland. I mean, in Northern Ireland it's quite clear, and almost every party I think now accepts this, that the size of the state has got too big. We need a bigger private sector.
The price for the DUP's participation will be the preservation of public services.
Our economy continues to recover slowly from 30 years of violence and conflict. We've had the impact of the recession, and obviously we want to ensure that the public services we have here are not undermined and damaged by massive cuts.
Sinn Féin confirmed it won't take up its 5 seats at Westminster. But for the others, including the Labour-linked SDLP with 3 seats, this uncertain ground offers up an opportunity, one they'll harvest if they possibly can.
Liz McKean, well, post-election Newsnight wouldn't be complete without our panel of political insiders, political junkies who've been wired for more than 24 hours now. In a moment, we'll be seeking their thoughts, their wider thoughts on the result. But first, we set them an exercise for our illumination, our own version of the inter-party negotiations. And as per the result, Danny Finkelstein for the Tories and Ollie Grender, the Liberal Democrats, are first in the smoke-filled rooms. I mean, obviously, there's certain things that are kind of completely easy, like scrapping ID cards and so forth. Okay. What's the gambit?
Look, the Tories would start with saying we've got a very serious situation, a very serious economic situation. And the second thing that's serious is there's only one stable government in this configuration. There isn't one with Labour because they don't have a majority. There's only one with the Conservatives. And within that context, the Conservative Party is prepared to make a big, broad offer to the Liberal Democrats, which is prepared to actually negotiate big compromises on issues that are on your list, your 4 subjects, your tax relief, your education, your green agenda, and an arrangement on electoral reform.
So, Ollie, you would go with the cutting spending plans now as part of the deal?
Well, we'd negotiate on the cutting and spending plans, I think.
The question is whether or not you would regard... my impression is that the Conservative Party wants a more ambitious, stable, longer-term deal. This is one of the big ironies of politics, giving to the Liberal Democrats more than the Liberal Democrats want to take. But I'm wondering whether the Liberal Democrats would be prepared to do a deal that goes beyond the 4 points, which wouldn't be enough to sustain a government.
And then the question back at this point, I guess, because that's quite a lot of what's on the list, especially, and you know, what we haven't bottomed out is the whole kind of PR,
electoral reform, top of the agenda?
Yeah,
Look.
so and you know, some kind of committee that chucks it into the long grass.
Well, can I suggest a way through on this? The Conservative Party says that it wants to allow government to not be the only organisation that has time in Parliament. The Liberal Democrats can have a portion of government time to introduce their own bills. You could introduce your own proportional representation bill and allow members to support it. If Gordon Brown intends to support electoral reform...
would the Conservatives take the whip for electoral reform?
My view is you wouldn't get a majority in the House of Commons. Okay. You wouldn't get it under Gordon Brown. You won't get it under the Conservative
Party. So, in fact,
Party.
electoral reform's a kind of dead duck.
But you would have the opportunity to put it to the
House
of Commons.
There's a chance to put it forward. And then I suppose the question that I then need to ask is how you intend to... it's the point that Michael Portillo made, which is how do you intend to underpin all that in order that the Liberal Democrats can trust that you are going to do what you say to them you are going to do? So how are you going to... What are the things, the mechanisms?
I think a big first point is, funnily enough, something the Conservatives already said they want, which is that there will not be an immediate second election. There would be the Conservative Party would agree a term for this particular government, and I think that's going to be a major concession. And it could agree a Queen's speech. So there's lots that can be put on the table. I think the big question in politics today is not can the Conservative Party make concessions. The one that they can't make, electoral reform, is one you can't get for the House of Commons. You can't get from anyone.
But you're saying there'd be some kind of device for the Liberal Democrats to go forward and try and have a referendum on it.
To put it before the House of Commons in exactly the same way that Labour could.
Let's say that the Liberal Democrats are not convinced of that, and they're prepared to talk about a kind of a much riskier coalition in a way with Labour. What's the price of your deal with Labour?
Well, again, it's kind of, if you think back, it's 1929, it's 1974, it's 1977, and it's 1997, and every time Labour has screwed us over, but pretended that it's going to help out on electoral reform. And, you know, whilst these are critical, all the things that are the 4 main points on the front of the manifesto, as described by Lord Wallace earlier, what we just want to know is how you're going to underpin any kind of agreement that has any basis of trust, given that in recent memory, even under Tony Blair, there was...
What I think Labour would say is put that behind you. This is an incredibly exciting, progressive moment, some people would say, on the Labour side. You can see Andrew Adonis and Peter Mandelson salivating at the prospect of a complete realignment of British politics with PR, locking the Tories out for a generation, having the progressive majority at most elections
You
from
can't
now
make
on.
it, of course, with the two of you. You'd be saying to the Liberal Democrats...
Well, you'd have to have smaller parties as well in there, but the prize is so potentially historic that a lot of people think that even if it appears a bit undemocratic, that a lot of people don't want Gordon Brown back in there, that let's say you'd have Gordon Brown for a year, you might then have someone else after that, you would give the Lib Dems the kitchen sink on everything else because the prize is so big. You'd say to them, come off it, you've got nothing in common with the Tories, they're in bed in Europe with a bunch of fascists who you're never going to want a Europe policy like that, on a whole range...
nutters of their own.
On a whole range of other things, immigration and whatever, you're miles apart. So this is a complete sham. You know you're a progressive. You know your rank and file are progressives. Come into bed with us. We can realign politics. That's what they would...
I'm going to come back to the counter-bargain in a moment, but let's just take the position of Gordon Brown. I mean, in that deal, if you were one of the deal makers, you would presumably have the removal of Gordon Brown up your sleeve.
Yes, although Gordon Brown, because he's the Prime Minister, is in charge of it, so it's really in his hands. What I think is an important point to say about Gordon Brown is that what he's done at this election is bought himself the space to go with dignity, and I think this is an important point. A lot of people thought he'd be annihilated. A lot of people thought he might have come third. What he's done now has got himself the space, and I think what he should do is to say over the next week, look, it would be undemocratic to try and forge this alliance. It is a sensible thing now to go. There has to be either a minority Tory government or
well, the problem is the problem with...
and I think he would get a lot of credit as the man who dealt with the recession, stopped the Tories getting a runaway victory, which they were likely to, would actually get a lot of credit from the party. But he should do that of his own choosing.
He can't be
now.
Britain's twice unelected. He can't be Britain's twice unelected Prime Minister. It would be hopeless.
And you'd be saying the Liberal Democrats would be supporting
the problem for this, what I call clunk, the problem I call the problem for what I call clunk clegg. You know, the idea of the two of you getting together is that you don't have a majority in the House of Commons between the two of you. So you get together and you're still in the same position that David Cameron is in before he does any sort of deal. That means the Liberal Democrats have to vote with Labour on every single issue. You're stuck with Gordon Brown. You go to another election, because you won't last that long because you haven't got a majority, led by Gordon Brown. That is, I give you my strategic advice, not a fine idea. The Liberal Democrats have effectively merged themselves with the Labour Party, not a fine idea. You cannot do this deal. You therefore have no choice but to deal with the Conservatives. And if you don't want a coalition, you're going to have to do a care and maintenance arrangement, which is by far the most likely outcome.
So a care and maintenance arrangement, or else, of course, the other option, of course, is that the Conservatives go into a minority government.
That's what I meant.
That
would be a care and maintenance.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, it would be
it would literally be.
But the truth
is... Which is about voting through the Queen's speech and the budget, or abstaining so that it can go through.
But could you
so you think actually you would give up the prospect of power for not getting either of your programmes? It is inconceivable, isn't it? Well, Nick Clegg is not going to go for one of them.
As per usual on this political panel, I tend to sit between a rock and a hard place anyway, and I think that's where my party is right now. And you know, it is an absolutely critical and difficult decision, because what do you do? Do you work with the Conservatives, which is a difficult leap of faith for most Liberal Democrats, or do you prop up a deeply unpopular Prime Minister? But if that Prime Minister goes, things will slow down in terms of any kind of reform, because then you're into a leadership contest.
OK, you've got very little time, each of you, now for Rio. What do you predict is going to happen next, first inning?
There's only one deal. There's only one stable deal, which is going to be the Conservative Party on a care and maintenance arrangement and elections soon, because this Parliament doesn't produce the arithmetic for anything else, I'm afraid.
I agree with that.
You agree with that?
Minority Tory government.
A minority Tory government and an election within the year.
Possibly minority Tory government. It's very difficult. Everything's on a knife edge at the moment. It's very interesting what's on the table right now.
Thank you all very much indeed. I'm sure you'll be back next week. One of the positives of last night was the high turnout across the country, but in many places the sheer number of people wanting to vote caused paralysis at polling stations. In Manchester, Sheffield and parts of London, to name but a few places affected, people were prevented from voting as polling stations closed, with hundreds still queuing outside. Tim Buell spent the day in the London borough of Hackney to find out what went wrong.
We just want to vote. We can exercise our democratic right to vote. Democracy. Why are you stopping that?
The highest turnout in years, a mass vote for democracy. But British democracy couldn't cope. Hackney was one place where police had to deal with angry voters. This man had arrived an hour and a quarter before polling ended, to no avail. Today he was at the town hall planning to make a legal complaint.
When I saw a queue, to begin with, I was quite happy. I thought, oh, we've got a high turnout, that's brilliant. And when it was apparent that we weren't going to get to vote, it was just gutting, basically. I feel sick about it.
Another voter flew home to vote in time, dashed straight from the airport, but was still disappointed.
There were too many people there. They couldn't deal with the amount of people. So they told me I wasn't allowed to vote, and it would be illegal for them to give me a ballot paper.
You come back specially?
I had come back from Cyprus, flew back that night to make sure I could vote.
Inside the town hall, the high turnout helped to delay even the start of the count until midday. Bad management at polling stations and inadequate funding by local authorities were blamed for the failure to cope.
It's all about maths, really. It's all actually possible to work out the number of people who are supposed to be voting, how long it takes to deal with each one, and make sure the resources are in place to deal with that.
What's your basic explanation? Simply inefficiency?
I can only assume that's part of the problem. I'm going to say I've raised it with the returning officer along with Diana, but we want him to do an official inquiry. We just need to know what's gone wrong here and make sure it never happens again. It's an embarrassment. It's not right for the people who are unable to vote, and it's not acceptable.
What's also very worrying to me is that it seems that an awful lot of the people who were denied the opportunity to vote last night were also first-time voters. And so many of them will be deterred, very probably, from wanting to vote again anytime soon.
As Hackney politicians watched events unfold at Westminster, the Electoral Commission, an independent body that sets standards for running elections, promised a thorough review of the system.
It's been at breaking point for some time. We've warned about that, and actually last night it broke, and we're going to need Parliament and Government to work with us as we make recommendations for improving it in the future.
Meanwhile, returning officers, here and in other cities, apologised, but also justified themselves.
The law actually says that at 10 o'clock, to be able to vote, you have to have a ballot paper in your hands. It's not that if you're in the queue at 10 o'clock you can vote. You have to have a ballot paper in your hands, and the law is very clear on that, and we pride ourselves here in Hackney on all of the other elections that we've run here very, very successfully on ensuring that the democratic process is followed to the letter.
But shouldn't the state ensure that citizens can vote before polls close? Currently, that's not defined.
I think we need to write into the law rights to vote. We need to make clear that if you do X, Y and Z, if you get there by 10, you will be guaranteed the opportunity to cast your ballot.
The lack of such a guarantee, he says, is just part of a system that baffles other democracies.
They're astonished that it's so laissez-faire, that it's so hands-off, that there isn't a dedicated election commission with funds and power to run a modern, effective election system, that we don't have an election law that's written for the modern age rather than the Victorian age, and they're astonished that it's so difficult to get redress after the event and find a way to go before a judge and get some sort of vindication for your legal rights. I think they think we're living in the Stone Age.
As the counts come to an end across Britain, there's no evidence yet that turning away voters has affected any parliamentary result. But that may not stop legal challenges from beginning.
Tim Hewer, well, it's been an extraordinary election, but what has it revealed about Britain, and has it changed the country for good? I'm joined by the historian Andrew Roberts and the writer and journalist Jonathan Freedland. Has Britain changed, Jonathan?
Well, it's very hard to make that kind of declaration after just such an inconclusive result. But it has revealed something, I think. And there were lots of American friends and colleagues coming on saying, this is your Florida. This has revealed how divided you are. And after the Florida 2000 US election, it was very clear they were a 50-50 country divided down the middle. We're nothing like so neat here. I mean, it's it's like a jigsaw puzzle, not one neat, clear division.
There was no, no uniform swing. There was fragmentation all over the place, and it appears that there is a kind of disconnect now between the way people operate and the way politics operates.
Well, I think you take that for granted after the expenses scandal. There were several MPs who fell because of their husbands or close friends, and as a result, that should be factored in, I think.
But that in itself, you think, was enough to show the kind of very odd results that happened here?
Well, there were going to be different geographical results, obviously. I mean, Scotland was completely different from the rest of the United Kingdom, for example.
I mean, it was quite tempting to think the old tribal politics had broken down. You know, in the 1950s, I think in 1951, just 2% of the British electorate didn't vote for either Labour or Conservative, and yet now it was only 55% did, and, you know, 45% voting for others. It's very tempting to think that. And halfway through the night, I was thinking that it's all broken down. Then the resilience of the Labour vote in so many places, despite everything, made you think maybe those tribal loyalties haven't completely vanished.
In particular, now that's another interesting sort of sociological point about tribal loyalties in places like Scotland, for example, being different elsewhere. The electorate is more fluid elsewhere.
That, and also the collapse of the UKIP and BNP votes. That was a very, I mean, obviously very attractive in many ways, certainly for Conservatives, that the threat from those parties to the right
does it now
evaporated.
but does it now mean, although you say you think that there are still tribal loyalties and we shouldn't overplay the idea there's a huge fluidity?
Well, it's both. I mean, things are breaking up, and yet there is still something there that's resilient. I mean, this was the election, surely, where the Labour vote, if it was going to crater and crumble, this would have been the time. In the end, the polls are wrong. Labour got back into second place, and in some of those citadels, those Labour citadels, they were still there, still standing, despite everything.
But that's also partly due to the genuine cratering of the Lib Dem vote, that everybody was expecting 80, 100
but anyway,
Lib
that's
Dem
the least
MPs.
tribal vote, isn't it? There isn't a Lib Dem tribe, and that's what's interesting. When it really came to it, they didn't have a social base to call on, one about class or religion or geography, in the case of Labour in Scotland, and also still in Wales. They didn't have that, and so because they were relying on individuals, it fragmented.
Or ideology. You know, constantly, in some things, the Liberals are to the left of Labour, to other things they aren't. And so when people put crosses in the boxes...
tribal, you're essentially saying that tribal loyalties still exist. Are you saying that in the 21st century there will just be different kinds of tribal loyalties?
I think so, and I think with the different attitudes, what people want out of politics seems to be different now from 1950, say, as Jonathan was talking about. In those days, with you know, the days of Churchill and Mr. Attlee, you were one or the other. Now it's much more complicated. What you're after is going to be much more nuanced, and the political situation, therefore, has to move with that.
But what people are now going to see, or maybe not, but just let's say that people are perhaps going to see over the next 6 months or so, how a certain form of coalition operates, you know, and it won't be full-blown coalition. It might be case by case. It might simply be a minority government. How will that affect the way people view politics?
Well, on the one hand, that's going to be something very, very new, and it could be an exciting new modern thing. On the other, what this election night was, why in some ways it was a shock to people, was it revealed how old and antiquated our machinery is. The sound you heard last night was this creaking of this ancient constitution. You had constitutional experts coming on to explain our system because it's not written down anywhere. You had the voting irregularities you've just reported on because it's a Victorian system.
No, simply because we, in our last 36 years, don't know about what happens in hung parliament doesn't mean that there's anything creaking about the concept of hung parliaments. We've had them many, many years, and certainly earlier in this century. And we have to go back now 100 years, back to 1910, since the Liberals won a general election.
But it's the way that actually elections are conducted in the future are going to change as a result of this, because no matter what happens, I mean, you know, our guests talk about the possibility of PR and reform, but it is possible now that we are going to have a fundamental reform for Westminster.
No, it's not, because Gordon Brown can't deliver it on such a tiny gap, and neither can the Conservatives, even if they wanted to, which they don't want to. So that is not going to happen.
I think probably Andrew's right about the politics of it, isn't it? There are those difficulties. The notion, though, that eventually that's where the trend is heading, I think that's hard to resist, partly because first past the post worked in an era like the 1950s when everyone was basically one red or blue, as Nick Clegg would say. It works in the United States where there's two big parties. If the system or political allegiances are fracturing and fragmenting...
Hang on.
Exactly. So the trend is in that direction.
Sorry, it is absolutely not. The whole point about the Liberal collapse in the vote and losing 5 seats is that nobody wanted PR. Nobody wanted that out of the last general election, and in the next general election we're going to have first past the post. We'll have a minority Conservative government going into
very hard to draw the conclusion that people didn't want PR from this result.
But what I would say is that if our guests are right, and in fact that we're going to have an election before the end of the year, it's certainly not going to be under a different electoral system. So
no, but since the Second World War, once a government is elected, it has always been re-elected, except for with Ted Heath, once out of 17 general elections.
Thank you both very much indeed. Tomorrow morning's front pages now. The Sun, squatter hold up in number 10. Man in luxury house, 59-year-old man in luxury house squatting near the Houses of Parliament, says the story. The Daily Telegraph, closing in on a deal. For the Times, it is the New Deal. 48-hour deadline for talks that could transform politics. The Daily Mail, now for the shabby deals as the election descends into shambles. Cameron and Brown battle for crushed Clegg's support. Difficult to say that. The Guardian, Clegg deal or no deal, and Jonathan Phelan there down at the bottom, forced to play fair maiden while suitors bow before him. And The Independent, one man's moment, his party's destiny, our nation's future. Well, with that, it's all from Newsnight tonight after a most extraordinary week. Join us again tomorrow night when Jeremy will be here with the last of our special election shows. Good night.